guys, and welcome back to History 125. Today we are going to be talking popes and kings, otherwise known as the politics of the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages was pretty political, and some of that stemmed from the rich culture that emerged. If you guys remember, during the Dark Ages, and we call it dark for a reason, right? It was grimy, grubby, deadly, all around not a fun time. But a couple things shift during the High Middle Ages. And remember, I said the High Middle Ages kind of start around the time of the First Crusade. The year 1000 is where I see it starting, but the First Crusade was called in 1056 or 65? 96. Oh my god, 1095. Ay, ay, ay. And the first thing that we start to see change, like I said before, are the knights. The knights now have a chivalric code, or the idea of chivalry. These things that they have to do to keep their honor. Honor became really important back then. And chivalry didn't just apply to how to treat women, it applied to just even getting your armor on or becoming a knight. So if you were a young boy and you wanted to be a knight, you would have to be an apprentice. You'd have to shine a shield a certain way, sharpen a sword a certain way, do these rituals involving your honor and the honor of the knight that you're serving. And obviously train in combat. And eventually, you could become a knight too. So, the other thing I just want to say is, could women be knights? No. Women could not have the official title of a knight, because remember, even though knights become warriors for the Crusades and stuff, their original purpose is to serve a lord. So a lord could not have a female knight. Technically. Could a lord who was maybe a little bit more woke have one? Could a woman join the chivalric code of knighthood and do the same type of jobs but just not have the official title of knight? Yes, to both. Yes, to both. But typically, no. Especially because once your honor gets involved, right, we have the idea of chivalry and honor, you might not want to jeopardize that. A lord might not want to jeopardize his honor by letting a woman serve, but some didn't really care as much, so. Next is the idea of tournaments. Tournaments like jousting, sword fighting, that kind of stuff. Very similar to like the Olympics in ancient Greece and even present day. Well, not ancient Greece, I'm sorry, classical Greece. And a tournament was a time for you to flex your skills, so it would just make you have even more honor or less honor. And the more honor or less honor you had could dictate who you were going to marry or where you're going to live. So tournaments become a really interesting thing. Another thing about the tournaments that's kind of cool is it was a social event. Just think of like any type of sporting event. A lot of people visit, and so it was a time for a lot of different people who don't usually get a break to talk and exchange ideas and different food and stuff. It was very similar to any type of sporting event we have nowadays. Life in a medieval town was interesting. At first, in the Dark Ages, we have these really heavily guarded castles. And that's it. There's a castle, and then there's a wall around it, and then outside the wall might be the farms. Now that there's a little bit more peace, because we're starting to have defined kings and queens and stuff, or really defined lords even, we start to see towns flourish, but since they built these walls, space becomes really, really important. I say that space is at a premium. So to get to be let's say a cobbler, someone who makes shoes, to get the best place, the most primo spot, you would either have to pay or know someone, and so these cities became really crowded and really gross, which will lead into why there was the plague, which we'll talk about 2 lectures from now. And it also led to this idea of having guilds. I think of guilds as like chivalry for non-knights. So if you wanted to make shoes, you would have to start off as an apprentice. You didn't make any money. You would just help the master and learn from them, be their like servant pretty much. And then after that you could become a journeyman. Journeyman, well, since it has the word journey in it, that's how I always remember, is someone who can kind of go out and sell their wares. They're like officially able to sell stuff. They can officially say, I am a cobbler and I've learned from, John and John Smith, and John taught me all of his ways, and so I'm going to be selling for John now. And as a journeyman, you get to make your own money, but like I said, you might owe some things to the master as well. And after that, after a while of being a journeyman, you would become the master yourself, and you could take an apprentice, and it would be your shop. So, and what about the role of women in the High Middle Ages? It's kind of interesting, because the richest person during the High Middle Ages in Europe was actually a woman. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was the ruler of an area in France that became a hot spot for politics, but women could be leaders, and women start to have regular types of jobs. The only thing that is a little different, besides not being able to be a knight for women in the High Middle Ages, is that marriage is absolutely the most important thing. Staying a virgin until you're married and then getting a husband was what women thought about all day, talked about to people. It was the number one priority, even for serfs, even for poor people. If you were poor, it wasn't as strict, but that was still the top priority. There was a change in the literature, so we start to see more poetry from a troubadour. A troubadour is someone who travels around and like sings poems. If you guys have ever seen The Witcher, or played the video game The Witcher, or read the books The Witcher, I really like The Witcher, so Dandelion, that character, would be like a troubadour. He was based off the idea of being a troubadour poet. I'm trying to think of another example. I don't know. Yeah, from The Witcher. And the next is Dante's Inferno, and I want you guys to watch this really cool video about Dante's Inferno. It's in 3 parts. The Inferno is the most famous part because it's about hell. And so Dante is a poet, and he writes about this journey through hell and figuring out who goes where, who suffers the most, who suffers the least, and it's really interesting politically, so I want you guys to watch this video, and something about this video will definitely be on our quiz. So please watch it now. Did you guys go watch it? I hope so. Our question is, what does Dante's Inferno say about the society that created it? Wow, we see such a strict hierarchy. We see really interesting religiosity, the comments on the popes, this idea of hell being layered, so you have just more values to crimes, like more consequences to crimes, which is really interesting. And he also is not afraid to talk politics. Think about the time of the Roman emperors. Even some of our more chill emperors would not have been okay with Dante talking crap about them, right? So this idea that Dante is writing about popes that are suffering in hell, or lords or kings and stuff that are suffering in hell, is really interesting about the social class and social structure. The reason why I also show you Dante's Inferno, this is some people's real favorite part of history. My best friend I went to high school and college with, he loves this topic so much, Dante's Inferno. And last year when I taught this course before, Dante's Inferno was pretty popular for the final project. A lot of people chose Renaissance art, but remember, this type of question about choose a piece of art and say what it says about society, give background information, then say what it says about society that made it, that's our final project. So if you think Dante's Inferno is cool, definitely check this out. Now we're going to get into something that is a little bit confusing, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to give you the highlights of nobility in different areas of Europe, and it's going to be fast. So if there's any of these people that you are interested in or want to learn more about, you can definitely email me or check in during my office hours. Like I said, when I was in college and took a 300 level course, we spent 3 weeks on each of these slides. Obviously, they weren't this slide. I made these. But you could spend a lot of time talking about these people. But we're not going to. We have a lot going on this week, especially because you had to watch Dante's Inferno too. So I try to keep these under 30 minutes when you have other things to watch. So. All right. Let's start with England. The English nobility. We have just 5 people of note that I think are important. These people will be showing up on your quiz and final exam. I don't know which yet, but they will. First, we have William the Conqueror. We remember him, right? William the Bastard. Well, after the Battle of Hastings, he becomes the King of England. And he makes a thing called the Doomsday Book, which sounds crazy, right? Like the Doomsday Book sounds like a thing about the end of the world. It wasn't. The Doomsday Books was a census of not only who was in England, but who owned what. So William the Conqueror, he's like, hey, I'm kind of the new guy on the block. I need to survey everything and see what's what. So he does this Doomsday Book census to see who owns what type of land, all this. Kind of similar to when Diocletian made the different taxes in the Roman Empire. We won't get into that. And after that, he makes the Oath of Salivary Plain, which was just making all of the people that were lords of an area make a pledge of allegiance to him. This is another reason why I say that around the year 1000 ends the Dark Ages, because now in England, it's not a free-for-all. It's not like Lord Smith is over in Eastern England and Lord, Brown is up in Northern England, and they're both kind of fighting and they're in charge. No, this is like William the Conqueror is the king. And if you don't like it, you can leave. But if you want to stay, you have to pledge allegiance to him. So no more fighting over who's the ruler. It's William. Our next is Henry II. Henry II has a really interesting relationship with this person called Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket and Henry II were friends, and they kind of rise up in the ranks, like they played together as kids, like they were friends. And Henry becomes the King of England, and Thomas Becket becomes the Archbishop, which is just a step or two below Pope. I believe it's just one step below Pope, of Canterbury. And Canterbury is really famous place in England. It's where St. Augustus went for when he first brought Christianity to England. So it's very important. And Henry II is being a king, right? He's flexing his power and he's making all these rules and stuff. Thomas Becket becomes kind of a narc, okay? He is Henry, you really can't say all of these things because the only people that really have power are Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit, and these people that do the work of these 3 others, like popes and me, Archbishop of Canterbury. And so Henry and Thomas Becket become kind of like frenemies. They started off as best friends, and now they hate each other. They'll exile each other. Henry kicks Thomas out, and then Thomas excommunicates or basically says Henry can't get to heaven, and they patch things up. But eventually, Henry supposedly is having dinner with his knights, and someone brings up Thomas Becket, and Henry goes, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" He's pissed off. He's like, "Will no one help me? Like, just get rid of this guy?" And the knights go and find Thomas Becket and kill him. They have him pray at the altar, and then they chop his head when he's praying. So Henry's kind of in some deep trouble because he just killed, by accident, I guess, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the people in England are not happy. The people in England are like, they love Jesus and Christianity, so they're like, "Henry, you just damned us all to hell with your stupidity." And so the next couple of kings start to lose some power. And a lot of it's because they're just duds. But I think some of it is also just the absolute anger of these Christian people after Henry II kind of commits this murder. So we have King John I. He sucks. King John I is really weak, and he makes a thing called the Magna Carta, which basically gives up a lot of power of the king. And the Magna Carta is kind of similar to like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and what is the one in France in the French Revolution? Oh, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. So it's we don't need to get into it. It's just relinquishing the power of the king. And who comes after him? Also, these dates don't line up because there's other people that are ruling. But like I said, we're just talking about 5. King Edward screws up even more and creates Parliament, which makes decisions like a check and balance system. So we have the king, and then we have the Parliament, which is like the House of Lords. So a lot similar to our president and then Congress, except obviously our president isn't chosen by like hereditary rule. You guys know what I'm saying. So even less power going to the king now. And the last we have King Edward II, and he was the 4th son, which was really unlikely that he would ever rule. So it is like patrilineage. So from like the male line is how you could end up being the king. And so to be a 4th son obviously means the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd would all have to die for you to be the leader, the king. And that happened. So King Edward II becomes the king after being really unlikely. And this guy was pretty unique. He was ultimately a failure as a king. It was said about him that he was really indecisive about big decisions and wasn't really strong. He was kind of crappy. But the interesting thing about him is that this leads him to be deposed and assassinated, but some historians don't believe this story fully. So this was at the time of, the 1200s and the 1300s. There had been the Crusades. Christianity was in full swing. Everyone was becoming Catholic. It was the cool thing to do. And Edward II was almost certainly 100% gay. He had a boyfriend, lover, whatever. His name was Piers Gaveston, and he would spend all of his time with Piers. He would give Piers special treatment. He would give Piers land that he had no right to give away. And so people became really upset about this. And in addition to being weak, in addition to like the homophobia, they depose him and assassinate him. And Edward II's assassination and deposition, I think that's how you would say it, are kind of hazy. There's some sources for and there's some sources against this. So I'm going to tell you what happened, but just take it with a grain of salt as far as if it happened or not this exact way. The point is, he was thrown off the throne and killed. But some say that his assassination was a hate crime. He was gay, and so to kill him, they took an iron from the fire and supposedly put it up his butt to kill him. And it was said that his cries could be heard from miles away, and it was what he deserved. So Edward II, he dies, but there's this deterioration of English nobility throughout the High Middle Ages, ever since Henry II. And it does shift, right? We have Richard the Lionheart, other people, but these are the 5 I want to talk about today. And you guys, I just want to say, I noticed that some of these dates were off. They were the dates that they started to rule and then the dates that they died. But some of them don't add up exactly. For example, Henry II, he died in 1184, but after the whole Thomas Becket thing, he's not the king anymore. And Richard the Lionheart is the king. So I changed the dates to their just birth and death year. Okay? So keep that in mind when you're going through. And like I said, there are some people in between. This is not a direct lineage. These are the people of note that I want to talk about today. All right, now we're on to the French nobility. And the French nobility descends from the line of the Capetian dynasty, which was from Ile-de-France. So Ile-de-France is Paris now. So this was the family that was in charge of the area where Paris is. And Paris is it's in northern France, but I want to say it's central France, central northern France, or maybe central eastern France. Yeah. And our first kind of king that calls himself the King of France, the actual King of France, not the King of the Franks, the King of France, is Philip II Augustus. And he, like I said, is from this area of Paris, and he starts to conquer and expand the French, the French territory, essentially. The next person that I want to talk about is Saintly Louis IX. Louis IX was actually canonized as a saint because he was a religious king. What was really interesting about Saintly Louis IX is he was a little bit more unorthodox because he was so Christian. He was seen as being really caring. There's this story about him sitting at the base of a tree trunk and having anyone who wants to talk about anything with France coming up to him, and he'd be like, "You, sir, do you have a question about France? Or do you have a comment or concern?" And the person would be like, "Yes, I do, King Louis IX. And he'd be like, "Okay, everyone quiet. We need to give this person our attention and hear what they have to say." So, yeah, he was a pretty cool guy. And he was holy. He was Catholic. We say he's canonized as the saint. The last one I want to talk about, France a little bit faster here, is Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair. Fair not meaning fair justice, fair fair skin, he was blonde. He was really blonde and light colored skin, fair skin. And he creates the Estates General. And if you remember from the French Revolution, the Estates General is what causes some of our problems. It is that French hierarchy of the king at the top and then the noblemen all below. And just like Parliament, the Estates General do have some power. So as you can see, it was kind of a trend as time went along to take away some power from the king, but then give it back to the people. Okay, guys, and the next one we have is the Holy Roman Empire, aka Germany and Italy, and modern-day Germany and Italy. And our first person is Frederick I Barbarossa. He basically created this kingdom of Germany, and he wanted more land, but the Pope did not like that. And he said, "I don't care what you think." Frederick I kind of pissed off the Pope in a big way. And the Pope was so pissed off that he was like, you need to go on the crusade if you want to be forgiven and get into heaven. And Frederick I is like, okay. So Frederick I is leading an army during the Third Crusade, and he's actually killed on the way to Jerusalem in a place called Armenia. And the next one that I want to talk about is Frederick II. And Frederick I was not his dad. Like I said, there's gaps in this because the dates here are the birthdays and death days. So there were different kings of the Holy Roman Empire in between. But I just want to talk about Frederick II. And we know a lot about him because of a thing called the Deeds of the Emperor, which was a biography written on him. And he was pretty much hated by the Pope in a big way. In fact, the Pope at the time, Gregory the Ninth, I want to say, maybe the 11th, he actually called Frederick II the Antichrist. Frederick II was excommunicated or kicked out of the church 3 different times, and he was really, really hated by the Pope. One of the reasons is he calls for a crusade, the Sixth Crusade, after he makes a deal to marry the, princess, well, I guess queen, but, of Jerusalem. And so Frederick II was at one time the king of Jerusalem, which was owned by Muslim people. And he's white and from Italy. So yeah, Frederick II was kind of interesting, but we don't have a lot of time to talk about him. So you guys, we are almost done. There's only a couple things that I want to talk about last, having to do with religion. So our first is the Spanish Reconquest, otherwise known as the Reconquista. And this was, just like it says, taking Spain back from the Muslim occupancy. It was pretty much full-blown Islamophobia. And what was interesting is, I don't know if a lot of you guys got to it in Global 10, but there's a conflict right now in around the area where Jerusalem is, called Israel. And it is a problem between the Israeli Jews and the Muslim Palestinians, and Palestine and Israel are basically the same place. And one of the tactics used against the Muslims is called a settlement. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's going into areas controlled by Muslim people, like now, today in Palestine, and just setting up shop and being like, this is my house now. Sorry. And what is really sad / interesting is that this tactic was used, almost 1,000 years ago on Muslims in Spain, but it was the Reconquista. So when the Christians went to take back Spain, they really had them settle down there. They were like, listen, we learned from the Crusades. Don't just go and take over and then leave. You have to go and make a home for yourself. And that's what happened. So Spain ends up being reconquered by the Catholic Christians in the early Middle Ages. I'm sorry, why did I say that? The high Middle Ages. Good thing we're almost done. There's only 3 sides left. Good thing we're almost done. There's also a change in religiosity. So we used to have the Benedictine order, remember, in the monasteries, where he was like, don't laugh too much. But that's starting to change. Now we have a couple different religious orders. And I want to tell you guys about 3 or 4 of them. Our first is the Franciscans, I don't know why I said that. It is the Order of the Friars Minor. So this is all about St. Francis. And St. Francis, I like to think, is a little bit more inactive. So the Franciscans are all about poverty and self-denial will bring you closer to God. Living as basic a life as you can is all you have to do. Love God, read the Bible, and don't buy fancy stuff. Just don't do it. That's the Franciscans. The other side of the coin is the Dominicians. And this was from a St. Dominic, but St. Dominic was a preacher. Preaching was his main thing. So I like to think of the Dominicains as the active ones, because they don't want to just sit at home in like some robes and read the Bible. They want to go out and, they really want to go out and preach. And they started this idea of the Inquisition. Oh my goodness, the Inquisition. We know about that. Maybe this is when we have the like preaching against heresy. So the Inquisition is like, claiming that people are like a witch or make deals with Satan, and then you get tortured. And there's a couple different types of the Inquisition. There's a few different Inquisitions. But the one main thing I want to say about the Inquisition is that you were given one chance to recover. So if someone said that I was a witch and caught me practicing witchcraft in the forest, I would not be tortured and killed right away. I would have one chance to be like, hey guys, that's really valid. I screwed up. You're right. I shouldn't have been burning sage and, I don't know, making like moon water. I don't know. I don't know what we just do, obviously. Anyway, so I would have one chance to be like, I changed my mind. Jesus is it for me. Like, I'm sorry I did all that. And then they'd leave you alone. But if you screwed up twice, you're dead. And even if you did or didn't believe in Christianity and stuff, the threat of dying and going to hell was pretty severe. So the Dominicains are kind of feared a little bit. The next group we have are the Beguines. Sometimes people say it differently. It kind of depends. And this was a order for just women. And what's kind of interesting, you guys, is that some scholarship says they weren't really religious at all. Some people think that this was just like a place for women to chill. Being a woman, like I said, was all about like staying a virgin, getting married, your husband owns you. Life's kind of crappy. But in this like monastic order, you could be like a group of 15 women and you run a farm. It was groundbreaking. There's a really cool book about that if you're interested in more. Our next one is the Albigensians. Did I say that right? Albigensians? Whatever. They're mostly called the Cathars. And the Cathars are from southern France. And they are a really, really interesting type of Christianity. They practice strict asceticism, not aesthetic. Not like lo-fi beats. Asceticism, which is like really strict denial. And they have interesting ideas, like I said. They believe that there's a good God. Like there's a good version of God. And there's a bad version of God. And they thought that human beings were actually angels. And you needed to practice true self-denial in order to get to heaven. And until you did that, you would be reincarnated to continue to fight bad God on earth. So they thought like when you have a temptation to sin, like that was just bad God tempting you. And if you could live your whole life with resisting bad God or any temptation to sin, then you could be finally broken the cycle. You could finally go to real heaven with good God. Seriously, that's what happened. And what's interesting is they had a really different idea about the role of women. They let women in. They were like, sure, because they thought you could be reincarnated as a woman sometime. If you live 8 cycles, maybe 3 of them, you're a woman. So they didn't care. And this was a huge threat to Christianity. They did not like that. The Christians actually had a whole crusade just to kill them, which is pretty interesting. They go on a crusade to go to the south of France and kill other Christian monks. Not cool, right? Not a cool look. The last thing I want to talk about is a couple different trends, and then we will be done for the day because this has been a really long one. Our first trend is saints. Virgin Mary becomes a thing. Virgin Mary was never really a thing. No one cared. But during this time, when we start to have chivalry and these really strict ideas about marriage, then we start to see you actually can worship a woman and you can think that women are okay, because this will also make women more chaste or like more virgins. Like, yeah. The next interesting thing is the idea of relics. If you guys remember, I started the course looking at a reliquary. A reliquary was a like box. In our case, it was an arm and a hand where it has holy things in it. And this is from the Crusades. So you could go to the Crusades, steal a statue, or like the nose of a statue, or like, oh, this was a big thing. Everyone said when they went back to Jerusalem, when they went to Jerusalem, they came home with a piece of wood and they were like, this is part of the cross that Jesus died on 1,000 years ago. Okay, whether it was true or not, that's a lot of the relics people would come back with would be like, Jesus, this was part of the, like, this is a stone that he really thought was important, or like, this is the cross that he died on. And people thought that it had like real healing power because it was like touched by Jesus. And the last thing is the idea of an indulgence. So an indulgence is a completely made up idea in Christianity. And it was the idea that you could pay to get into heaven. So this picture here is a woman, and she is getting an indulgence for like her dad or something, maybe even herself. And the idea was you didn't have to be good. As long as you had money and on your deathbed there was an indulgence that you could die and still go to heaven. And the really interesting thing, you guys, is you could purchase an indulgence for a dead person. It could be any bad person. Like, you could literally purchase an indulgence for like the High Middle Ages version of Ted Bundy, and he could still go to heaven. And since this is a totally made up idea, this really changes the culture of the church. It makes the church rich, and the church already becomes rich because some of these kings, they end up saying that churches don't have to pay taxes on the land. And so the church becomes rich. What even is sin if you're a rich person? And it changes the whole culture, which is really interesting. And we're going to end there for today. So this was a long one, but next one will be a lot shorter, I promise.